Start the DVD. Greetings, citizens, and welcome to another edition of Flashpoint, a television program about issues and ideas. Flashpoint is brought to you by the Lawrence Debate Union. What's that? Why, it's an endowed co-curricular activity at the University of Vermont that trains UVM students in the arts and skills of debating, then has them debate educationally and competitively against other sentient beings from throughout the region, the nation, and the world. One of the other things the Lawrence Debate Union does to promote discussion, dialogue, discourse, and debate in our community is to bring you Flashpoint. And we do it in a big way. That's why we're on show 369. Where are all those other shows? Why, they're located online. And you can have viewing on demand. Go to our website at debate.uvm.edu and click on the Flashpoint icon, and you will be delivered to a vast panoply of discussion in the form of Flashpoint programs. My name is Alfred C. Snider. I'm the Edwin W. Lawrence Professor of Forensics at the University of Vermont. That's a mouthful, but I'm proud of it. And I'll be your facilitator for this discussion. Let's meet our panelists for this program. On my far right, I have the Dean of Flashpoint panelists, Sam Ricker. Lean in a little there, buddy. There he is, who is a debater at the University of Vermont, who's known for his mastery of Frank Zappa lyrics and his homespun charm. What is the Flashpoint program in the future that you really think we should do?
Oh God, being put on the spot, I wouldn't know what to say. I think we should really talk about military intervention in Pakistan, as that's kind of a hot topic.
Okay.
So I think that's one for the future.
All right, cool. Seated in Yeller, next to Sam, we have Allison Faye Hamlin, who's a local from Essex Junction, right?
Yep.
And she's a first-year debater here at the University of Vermont. What's the worst thing about being on the debate team?
I don't have time to go home. I was gonna go home today and have my parents make me food, and I just love it so much that I can't ever make it home.
Well, they're probably having a ball without you. So.
Probably.
Okay.
Thanks.
So, you know, on my immediate right, I have Sam Natale, who's from, I don't know, some vacation spot in Florida.
Yeah, one of them. West Palm Beach.
West Palm Beach, okay. What's the most shocking thing about having to live in Vermont instead of West Palm Beach?
I think it's the idea of seasons. I come from one long summer of varying temperatures, but when the leaves fell for the first time, nobody had told me that this was supposed to happen, so I really thought the world was going to end, and then the catastrophic winter that followed only enforced this notion.
Well, welcome to reality here on Planet Earth. Seated on my immediate left, I have Jacob Klein, and Jacob, you're, besides being a debater, you're a member of the Tech Cats, and what does that involve doing?
Well, it involves doing a lot of computer work for faculty at UVM. I feel like I'm teaching people how to read books a little bit. It's a little bit repetitive, and it's stuff that I learned when I was in middle school, but everybody needs to learn computers someday.
And it's got to be fun to teach faculty how to read books.
It is.
All right. Next is Madeline Murphy Hall, who's the president of the Lawrence Debate Union now for the second year. Recently I heard that the SGA vice president was impeached. Do you think there's any danger that you'll be impeached as the LDU president? Not after the research meeting you led last night. Okay, very good. What would you say to students who might become president in some future moment?
That's a tough question. I'd say it's a great responsibility and is really worth it. Kind of puts you in a very good leadership role, and it's I don't know.
It's leadership.
It's leadership and it's finance.
I like leaders who say, I don't know once in a while. On our far left, we have Justin Irving, who's a new debater here at the University of Vermont. and comes to us with a distinguished academic background. I just heard you spent a year in China.
I did, yes.
How was that?
It was excellent. Really got to know Imodium quite well. And learned some Chinese. It was a great time.
But I understand you also speak other languages.
I pretend that I speak German and Swedish, yeah.
Okay. But you had a little Norwegian early on.
I did. Well, Norwegian and Swedish are very close.
Right, so that's because none of us can tell the difference.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is our panel for this week's discussion. Yes, we're here at 369, price tag for food. Guess what? I bet you noticed it went up. In fact, since the beginning of 2008, global food prices have gone up precipitously. And this is having effects. Not just does it switch the kind of things that people have to spend their income on, but there are a lot of people in the world who don't have enough income to eat anymore, as well as it's benefiting some farmers who are doing better now because of it. And so there are winners and losers. We're going to talk about who those people are in this edition of Flashpoint. Let's start by talking about causes. Food prices have gone up all around the world. Now that's not surprising since we have a global market for food now. Food crosses boundaries readily. Whether we think that's good or not, we may talk about later. But what are some causes of the rise in food prices?
Well, probably the rise in oil prices is going to bring up the food prices. If you're buying your apples from Peru and they got to be shipped over, they're going to go up in price significantly.
Now, you grew up on a farm,
Mm-hmm.
and you use a lot of energy on the farm.
Right. A lot of your energy goes into the food for tractor use, but the majority of it is shipping.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even here in Vermont, most of the food we eat comes from California. So that's really expensive to drive food across country.
So oil prices, I assume there are no other causes.
Well, kind of the big one is the switch in America to trying to use our food to create biofuels. So we're essentially growing food and then burning it to create energy, which is not only immensely wasteful, but these heavily subsidized food sectors are then able to sort of dump those products abroad, and then the other markets that could have moved in to supply the shortage simply can't compete with the pricing. And so now that we've stopped producing enough to feed the world and these other sectors are unable to come in, you just have a lack of food for too many people.
And also in the same vein, I think we're seeing additional processing going into the production of our food. So the corn that we would have maybe turned into cereal or bread or any sort of like immediate product is now being refined and made into things like cornstarch or animal feed. And the cornstarch is being processed additionally, and the animal feed goes to feed animals, which are increasingly an inefficient way to take a raw product and disseminate it to the most effective audience.
I mean, it takes 10 times the amount of, it takes about 10 pounds of wheat or feed to create 1 pound of beef. And so it's just, and as the world becomes more affluent and starts consuming more meat, you have a lowered efficiency of the amount of food that
But clearly those practices came out of the excess of corn, because people didn't even know that you could feed corn to cattle before they just tried it. And they realized that cattle grow a lot faster. It's bad for them. It's not what they naturally eat, but they grow 10 times faster.
I understand the 10-to-1 figure of grain to meat trade-off. That's a favorite one of debaters throughout the decades, and it goes between 5-to-1 and 10-to-1 depending on what grain. But it's certainly a huge waste of food resources. Well, who's eating so much meat all of a sudden?
Well, I think you see a huge rise in the Chinese, especially as their nation has become more affluent. They have seen this Western switch into consuming meat products, and that traditionally takes them away from very efficient forms of soy-based diet. And soybeans have been, throughout the ages, been a very effective way to feed a large number of people. and reduce the amount of processing necessary to feed these people. So now that they're eating more and more meat, you see a shift away from these soy products, which have been most effective in feeding a large amount of people and could possibly hold the key to our future protein dilemma.
And I think that's a trend we're not seeing just in China, but around the globe.
Oh,
There's
absolutely.
more, as nations are becoming more affluent, they're eating more meat, just following the West in the
Yeah, like Brazil has increased their meat
Right.
consumption hugely,
Yeah.
which they didn't have much
It's a
before.
product of luxury.
Right. And so but why does that mean a problem? It's only the affluent who are doing it, right? Affluent are eating more meat and they can afford it.
Well, the thing is that the amount of food that we're producing, just because of the way that in which we produce food, is sort of zero sum in the short term. In that, if you're diverting, if for instance cows are consuming wheat, then that increases the demand for these grains, and that increases the price of. I mean, there's even larger market factors here too, such as with the decline of the credit market and the decline of other sort of stocks and investments. Many people have increasingly been turning to speculation in the commodities market, especially food trading.
I think we should be careful about blaming speculators for all the food price rises, though, because we haven't seen hoarding of food. Food stocks are the lowest they've been in recent history, and also the market for hogs, the futures for hogs, have been highly traded, more than most of the other food commodities. But the price of hogs has actually fallen, and in the last month or so, food prices, broad food commodity prices, have fallen. And we're not blaming speculators for the fall in the price.
Well, that's, I think, largely because the bubble that was supporting it popped too. Because we saw this biggest bubble increase when all sorts of commodities last year were up, and we're seeing a recession of that bubble.
Yeah, and the trend that's been happening in the housing market has been happening in the farming industry a lot too. Farmers come to the bank and say, look, I have no down payment, but I want to buy $1 million tractor so I can produce 10 times as much as I'm producing. And banks have traditionally just been like, okay, sign here. And the same kind of situation could happen and is happening with the farmers.
right.
One of the other causes is that countries who feel it's in their best interest, often for political stability, to have plentiful food and low prices, have put in new trade barriers to stop food exports. Thailand's a pretty good example of that, where they are sort of a rice bowl and have exported a lot of rice, but looking ahead, they said maybe harvest will go down, so let's stop exporting rice. So Thailand's okay. Meanwhile, Bangladesh is in incredible trouble because they don't produce the rice but need to buy it.
We're producing so much food that we've always had excess.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, that's one thing too. Like if you look at Jamaica, for example, we ship a lot of our excess potatoes and carrots to Jamaica, and also we started shipping powdered milk to Jamaica, and that's put out their dairy industry. They had to open up taps of huge milk, so they have no fresh food coming from Jamaica anymore because they're becoming dependent on the U.S. So I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah, and then when the U.S. stops fulfilling that role, because we've started diverting our energies into other sectors, or
Right.
our food into energy, then you see, at least in the short term, the product of that reliance.
Right, because they have no infrastructure to make their own food anymore.
Well, they're particularly reliant on the U.S. agribusiness structure. Like there are several large companies that control not only like the seeds but the fertilizer and all these things that get imported. And specifically, companies like Monsanto are selling seeds that don't perpetuate. They only last for one generation.
Right.
So you see people abandoning traditional agricultural practices, actually saving seeds and planting crops that are best suited for the environment in favor of higher yield crops, which are actually,
but at the
not-
same time, who are we to say if your country is starving, you shouldn't, keep your, you shouldn't try everything that you possibly can to make a higher yield so that you can feed more people. I think
Well-
it's a little ambiguous of us saying that, they should keep tradition when they have starving people, and they should really be trying everything. they can.
But it's kind of a Faustian bargain with some of these designer seeds because they require more other inputs like fertilizers and pesticides, and then you have to buy more seed instead of using the seeds from the past. So in many cases, rural farmers who perhaps should be better educated are, falling ploy to these kind of things in some countries, and it's hurt them. High yield varieties have not necessarily meant more net grain. For example, in 2005, there was a 3.6% decrease in cereal grains in the world, and in 2006, a 6.9%. So maybe that sort of explains why global food stocks are at a very low level. We don't have, the extra that we previously had.
And I think we also need to talk about why just production in general has fallen is the climate changes are making many areas no longer arable either. There's desertification, or you also see flooding in areas, meaning that there's just less arable land on which to grow food. And I think that the world production in the last year or two dropped maybe 4%, simply because we're trying to adapt to this massive change.
Japan's a country that doesn't have a lot of land space to grow food. And what their strategy has been is to use high yield crops and tons of fertilizer. Their crops traditionally get 10 times the amount of yield that even American high yield crops do. And I think what we're coming down to is really looking at the cost-based analysis, and it may not be more cost-effective for people who can't purchase high volumes of fertilizer and the pesticides that are necessary for these high-yield products. So it may not necessarily be more efficient.
I think it also marks a shift. It's a little disarming to monoculture, which I think we've seen a lot in the last century or so, in that people are losing the amount of diversity that is inherent in their crop base. And so in doing that, they become more susceptible to things like plagues or infestations. And I think that the response of genetically modified crops attempts to address this issue, but maybe does so in a way that is not as effective for all. And because not everybody can afford this amount of fertilizer or this amount of upkeep on their crops, and by putting, so to say, all your eggs in one basket, you effectively decrease your chances of being able to successfully harvest all of this crop if something catastrophic happens to you. And therefore, I think we see this as impacting a lot of our world economy through the food market, because they're no longer able to.
There's no structure to support the system. Like if oil's so costly that you can't get the pesticides, you can't get the fertilizers, you can't get the seeds you need for high cost or high yield growth, it won't work. Maybe what we're needing to see is more localized operations where you're using a system that the seeds and the farming methods can be all local, where you don't have to import all this other stuff from companies.
Boy, when I asked you guys what the causes of the problem was, I didn't realize we would get such a comprehensive answer. And I'm sure that there are other causes, but I sort of want to move on to winners and losers, because in a market system, usually some people win and some people lose. Who are the winners with higher food prices?
I think Kazakhstan and Ukraine are going to be winners in the long run. They've got a lot of unused farmland from the Soviet period that wasn't able to come online because of the mess that was left over after the Soviet Union collapsed. And now that food prices are still quite high, they've really in a great position to enter the market and benefit from that.
I think farmers are going to be the winners. Higher food prices means more for the farmer and more business. I think we're going to see more farms growing.
Yeah. I think you can talk about it in terms of groups of people and countries, and I think in terms of groups of people, it's going to be farmers and rural farmers that have really done well, and urban people in general, especially the urban poor, who are going to be most hit by this. And you have certain countries as well that are more agrarian or more urban, and you can draw the winner and loser dichotomy on that line too.
Okay, some people are going to lose.
I think that right now, especially we're seeing in Oceania and especially Australia with their decline in wheat production, they are the second largest wheat exporter in the world. And because of the climate change, now they're hit very hard with droughts and other sort of impactual climate activity that has severely decreased their ability to produce these crops. And as such, I think that now more than ever, they're realizing that their stability in a market position is not quite as consistent as they would have hoped or realized for the future.
Yeah, and we have to take into account that like here it's mostly, it impacts me in terms of how much a loaf of bread costs, but we have to remember that in other countries there are riots going on in the streets because people are starving. And so, you know, the United States is gonna, you know, I'm gonna pay more for my Wonder Bread, but ultimately everyone's gonna be able to feed their kids.
Right, so ultimately it will be the urban poor who are losing the most because they're not getting any money from the price increase of the crops that they're not producing crops. So they simply have to pay more for food and the ramifications will hit them the hardest.
Okay, well, what happens, and we're probably talking about a lot of people, because as they say, there's 1 billion people who live on less than $1 a day.
Yeah.
And when food prices go up, then you can't afford to eat. And if you have urban poor who are already paying 50 or 60% of their income for food, and all of a sudden they have to spend 75% of their income, we're going to have some people who are just hungry and starving. What are likely to be some social effects of that?
I mean, I think that you've seen already in countries, especially in North Africa, very tense political climate, and that you have a lot of people who are just upset, poor, and with good reason to be. And so you've just seen a lot of governments either cracking down on these and sort of moving away from the progress that they'd made in order to try and hold on to power over a group of people who blames them for the food issues in the country. And so you've just seen just an increase in instability in general in all the regions that have been hardest hit.
I think it'll be a resource war. I mean, food's a resource that people depend on and rely on and need to function, and you'll see an increase in fighting for that reliability, that life, you know.
And I think that's the majority of the world. This is a majority world problem, and we can sit in a minority world like the United States and say, well, you know, we do need to pay more for our milk or our bread, but it's not a big of a deal. And I think that reduces the activism on our part and the part of people who maybe are in a solid enough position food-wise to advocate for those people who are not. And the fact that we're not hit in a way that affects us as directly has sort of negated our attention to a more global problem.
Right, of course. It's easy to read about it, but you're so detached from it when you're
I don't
simply reading
remember
about
the
it.
last time I was
Exactly.
hungry.
But I mean, at the same time, like, we have to make sure that if we did respond, it would have to be in a way that would be positive. It's always possible that our response could make things worse and entrench the dependence that was the problem in the first place.
For sure.
We could start with getting rid of the ethanol mandate. That would be a great way to.
Okay, well, let's move on to solutions, right? What can we do to try to, because clearly hundreds of millions of people are going to face starvation if the status quo continues. And so you say, do away with the ethanol mandate.
Yeah, absolutely. Do away with the ethanol mandate and open up the United States to trade from other countries. We have sugar embargoes on most countries. We have an onion embargo until very recently. An onion embargo was put in the 1950s, and it was no good. But if we open up trade in the United States, then that'll encourage the rest of the world to sell their products in the U.S. They'll have economies of scale, hopefully. That'll drive the price of food down in the long run, I think.
Maybe the global system is actually the problem and not the cause, because ultimately the local industries have been broken down by another country or that could produce the same food for cheaper, and they stopped producing it. And now we're suffering from the consequences because prices are up for transportation, the food can't get there, it's going to cost more when it does.
I mean, I've heard about this local food movement. Does anybody know much about that?
Well, local food movement is based on reducing the amount of transportation required for your food. It's also based on sustainable energy practices or just sustainable farming. So to say that you're going to grow crops that are suitable for your area, the climate, and also the amount of labor that you are able to produce, to put into producing these crops. So if anyone's interested, there's actually a really interesting book. Barbara Kingsolver wrote this book called Animal, Vegetable, or Miracle. And it's a really interesting, it's a year about her experience trying to sustainable farm in, I think it's upstate New York, but I could be wrong. And this movement, especially in Vermont, has gained a lot of footing, and we've tried to open a couple of sustainable agriculture restaurants. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to make acorn meal and subside on root vegetables during the winter, but it does mean that you need to be more conscious about where your food is coming from, how it's getting there, and what it means to the farmers who are producing it.
I think it's a great idea, but it won't be. It's not plausible in some nations where there's extreme drought and other problems that they're not even able to grow food.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a great idea in a country like the United States where a lot of places are able to grow their own food, but in other places it's not even an option.
Right.
What else?
Well, I think in terms of talking about what can we in the United States do to lessen our impact, even though we are a minority of the population, the amount of food that we consume does have an impact on the world. So there was this book, In Defense of Food, and I forget the author's.
Michael Pollan.
Yeah, and his mantra was eat food, mostly plants, not too much.
Yeah.
And
Less
that's
meat.
pretty much the epitome of trying to change people's attitudes towards food in the United States. We see overeating, we see people eating things that they know are bad for them and eating too much of it. So what we need to do is eat more, unprocessed foods.
And I think more than just societal changes, I'll make myself the pariah of the table here and say that genetic modification and the engineering of more crops in places that are going to be able to use them, possibly without the predatory nature that a lot of the genetic modification has happened on. But it's a good technology that I think could be very useful for helping feed places that will need it most.
Yeah, we need seeds that can grow in the desert because otherwise they're going to starve. It's just that simple.
But we also need to remove that element of corporate interest in producing
Yeah,
this
for
food,
sure.
because we've talked about already how
We
these
live in a
one
free
cycle
market
crops
system.
exactly.
Suicide genes and corn is
Yeah, that's
Exactly.
ridiculous.
I think it's important not to exaggerate the potential of a local food movement. I think that it's very hard to get away from comparative advantage. And there have been studies done where they measured how much carbon was emitted, how much petrol was used to transport tomatoes from within Connecticut locally and then across California to Connecticut. And they used a tractor-trailer truck that gets 5 miles per gallon versus a pickup truck that gets 12 miles per gallon.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
You get better economies shipping it from California.
Your food's
actually.
fresher. There's more nutrients in it.
And
it's
the money
healthier for
stays.
you.
Yeah, the money stays in the
I mean,
market.
there's benefits, but as far as addressing the root problem, not having enough food, I think that
Well, we don't need to eat so much tropical fruit. We live in Vermont.
Yep. There's
and
one.
There's no doubt that
Isn't it flown in?
that costs a lot of extra money.
Or meat. I mean,
I also think there's an incredible amount of food waste.
Yeah.
And there's a really big campaign going on in the UK now to fight food waste, and I bet it's every bit as bad here in the United States. And you were talking about changing trays.
Trayless dining on campus.
Trayless dining, you
Yeah.
get less food?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, this is a huge topic, and we can probably talk about it for another half hour. But, knowing us. But I just wanted to finish by asking a question. 2 years from now, will the food crisis be better or worse? And we have about 45 seconds for us all to answer that question. So I'm going to start with the dean. Sam Ricker, better or worse?
I think it's going to get worse before it gets better, and especially 2 years is a narrow time frame for us to wake up and realize what needs to be done. So I think in 2 years it'll be a lot worse.
Alli Hamlin.
I think in 2 years in the minority worlds like here, I think it will improve slightly, but I think in the majority worlds, overall, I think you're gonna see a rapid decline in the amount of social justice and the amount of our ability to feed each other.
Sam Natale.
I disagree. I think it's going to get better. I think this is largely a problem of sort of entrenchment in old systems and traditional dependencies. And as soon as, in 2 years, we're going to see ourselves moving into the situations that are going to alleviate the problem.
Jacob Klein.
I think it's going to get a lot worse because people are going to be investing, and the price of food is going to bubble again, and then it's going to get worse. I think just much worse.
Madeline Murphy.
I'd like to be optimistic about this one and say it's going to get a lot better. I think that we clearly see that there's a problem right now and people are starving, they're suffering, and there are solutions out there that we can implement now to make it better within 2 years.
Justin Irving.
Absolutely better. This is an old problem, at least a year old. Prices are very high. There's a lot of money to be made, and commodity prices have already started to fall quite a bit. It's already getting better.
All right. Thank all of you, and thank you for watching this edition of Flashpoint. Please don't forget our advice.
Think
for yourself.
That's a good one.
Okay, turn the DVD